My name is Dana Whitfield, and I am 36 years old. 4 days ago, at my father's funeral, in front of about 40 people who had known our family for most of their lives, my mother stood up next to his casket, thanked everyone for coming, and announced that my younger brother would be inheriting the house on Birch Hollow Road because he was, in her words, the son who stayed. Then, while people I hadn't seen in years were still hugging each other over paper plates of sheet cake, she handed me an envelope, old and a little soft at the corners like it had been sitting in a drawer for years, and told me this was not the time to be asking questions about the estate. I put the envelope in my coat pocket, and I did not open it. Not at the funeral home, not in the parking lot, not that night. What nobody in that room knew, including my mother, was that my father had spent the last 14 months of his life quietly building something none of us were supposed to see until it was too late for anyone to talk him out of it. If you have ever been the one who left home to build a life and came back to find you'd been rewritten as the one who abandoned it, stay with me, because this story does not end where you think it does. I make my living reading numbers that are supposed to add up and don't, and finding the exact place where they stop matching, and I promise you this one has an answer. If that's the kind of story you come here for, go ahead and subscribe, but only do it if this one earns it, because I'm not interested in you sticking around out of habit. And if you've ever had a family member hand you a version of events you knew wasn't true and just watched you swallow it in front of a room full of people, tell me in the comments. I read everyone. To understand why my mother stood at my father's casket and gave my brother a house that was never legally hers to give, you have to go back to Millbrook, Ohio, population 4,180. A town with one stoplight, one diner called Sawyer's that has been serving the same meatloaf special since before I was born, and one church, First Lutheran, where my mother has been the secretary for 21 years. My father, Walter Whitfield, ran a machine shop out on Route 9 called Whitfield Tool and Die for 34 years. He made precision parts for auto suppliers 2 counties over. The kind of work where a part that's off by 0.003 of an inch gets sent back, and he used to say that a machine doesn't care about your excuses, it either fits or it doesn't. I think that's where I get it from. I became a forensic accountant, which mostly means I get paid to sit with a stack of numbers that are supposed to tell a clean story and find the place where somebody quietly changed what the truth looked like. My father used to joke that we did the same job, just with different tools. My brother Colby is 32, 4 years younger than me. When we were kids, the difference between us was small, the kind of thing you don't notice until you're an adult looking back at old photographs and realizing his bedroom had the good window and mine had the one that faced the neighbor's shed. It wasn't cruelty, not at first. It was just an order of preference nobody said out loud. My mother took him to every dentist appointment personally and let me get dropped off by whichever neighbor was headed that way. When I made honor roll in 10th grade, I got a magnet on the fridge. When Colby made the JV baseball team 2 years later, we had cake. The person who noticed, and who never once let me feel like I'd imagined it, was my father's older sister, my Aunt Vivian. She lives 40 minutes away in a town called Marrow's Bend. And for as long as I can remember, she is called every single Sunday at 6 o'clock in the evening, no exceptions, not for weather, not for a cold, not for the year she broke her hip and called from a hospital bed instead. She taught me how to make my father's favorite dish, a beef and paprika goulash, out of a teal ceramic mixing bowl with a chip in the rim that she still owns. And when Marcus and I got married 9 years ago in a backyard with 40 folding chairs because that's what we could afford, Vivian was the only person on my father's side who stayed for the whole reception instead of leaving after the ceremony because she had somewhere to be. My mother and father left at 7:15 before the cake was even cut because my mother said the drive home in the dark bothered her eyes, though I noticed she managed a 2-hour drive home in the dark from Colby's company holiday party the following December without any trouble at all. Vivian stayed until the last folding chair was stacked, helped Marcus's mother wrap the leftover cake in foil, and drove the 40 minutes home alone, in the dark, without ever once mentioning that her eyes bothered her too. I didn't understand, at 27, how rare that kind of unremarkable, unglamorous loyalty actually was. I understand it now. To understand my mother, you have to understand that she has spent 21 years being the person at First Lutheran who keeps the books balanced to the penny for the building fund, the missions committee, the ladies' guild treasury, every line item accounted for, every receipt stapled to its corresponding entry in a binder she updates by hand every Sunday after the second service. People in that congregation describe her as meticulous, dependable, a woman who never lets a number get away from her. I used to find that funny, in a way that had nothing to do with humor, because the same woman who tracked every dollar of the youth group's car wash fundraiser to 4 decimal places could not, or would not, ever seem to track the actual cost of raising 2 children unevenly. I don't think it was really about money for her, not underneath it. I think it was about a story she needed the congregation and herself to keep believing that the Whitfields were a family that took care of its own, in front of witnesses, whatever that required behind closed doors. I left Millbrook at 18 for a state school 220 miles away, and I have never regretted it, but I want to be honest with you about something, because this genre of story usually pretends the person who left had some grand plan. I didn't. I left because a guidance counselor named Mrs. Petrakis looked at my transcript and told me I was wasting it staying local, and because some part of me already knew that if I stayed in that house, I would spend the rest of my life being compared to a brother who was never asked to compare himself to anything. My mother's response, when I told her I'd gotten into the accounting program at the state school, was to ask who was going to help her with the church rummage sale that October. That was the whole conversation, not congratulations. A scheduling conflict. My father was not a talker. He worked the floor at his own shop until he physically couldn't anymore, and even after he hired a foreman to take over the day-to-day, he'd still drive out there most mornings just to stand in the doorway and listen to the machines run, the way some men listen to their own heartbeat to make sure it's steady. He measured things for a living, and I think that shaped how he loved people too, quietly, in units he could account for. A birthday call at 9 sharp, a drive to help me move that he never mentioned to my mother. He wasn't a demonstrative man, and for a long time I mistook that for indifference, the way you'd mistake a part that's precisely machined for one that's simply plain. Here's where I need you to understand something before I go any further, because it matters for everything that comes after. My father was not the villain of this story, and he was not entirely the hero of it either. For most of my adult life, he was the enforcer, not the architect. He never once defended me out loud in front of my mother. But he called me on my birthday every year at 9 in the morning before work, and he was the one who drove 3 hours each way, alone, without telling my mother where he was going, to help me move into my first apartment when I was 22 and had exactly $430 to my name. He built things, he fixed things. He just never once, in front of her, said the word unfair out loud. I used to think that made him a coward. I don't think that anymore, and you'll understand why by the end of this. Let me take you through what happened over the next 11 years, because none of this was one dramatic moment. It was an accumulation, the way rust is an accumulation, one small, unremarkable thing after another until one day you look at the whole structure and realize how much of it has quietly given way. Item 1. In the spring of 2015, my father had his first cardiac event, a mild heart attack that put him in the hospital for 4 days. I flew home. I sat with him. When I got back to Columbus, I saw the copay on his cardiology follow-up, $150, sitting unpaid on a bill my mother had mentioned in passing like it was a mosquito bite, an annoyance she'd get to eventually. I mailed a check. 2 weeks later, it came back in my mailbox, uncashed, folded into a plain envelope with my mother's handwriting on a torn scrap of notebook paper. We're not a charity. That was the whole note. I kept the check. I photocopied it before I threw the original away, because some instinct in me, the same instinct that later became my entire career, told me to keep a record. I didn't know yet that I was starting a folder. I just knew I didn't want to forget the exact wording. Item 2, 2016. My father needed a wheelchair ramp built off the side porch after a bad fall that fractured his ankle, $612 in materials. I sent it. It came back 3 weeks later, this time not even folded, just shoved into the return envelope so hard it had crumpled one corner. Item 3, 2019. His second cardiac event, more serious than the first, and a home oxygen concentrator, the insurance only partially covered. $1,185 for the balance. I sent it overnight because I was scared because he'd sounded so tired on the phone that week. It came back torn in half, taped back together just enough that the post office would deliver it, with a sticky note on top that said, in block letters, "Stop." I want to pause here because this is where I need to tell you what real family looked like during those same years. Because if I only tell you the bad parts, this stops being a true story and starts being a grievance list, and that's not what this is. While my mother was mailing checks back to me, my Aunt Vivian was driving 40 minutes each way, every single Tuesday, to sit with my father through his cardiac rehab appointments, because my mother had Ladies Guild treasury meetings that somehow never once got rescheduled in 3 years. Vivian brought him goulash in that same chipped teal bowl every week because it was the one meal that didn't upset his sodium restrictions and still tasted like something. Nobody asked her to do that. She just did it the way she'd always just shown up, without being the kind of relative who needed credit for it. If you've ever had one relative who showed up in the small, unglamorous ways nobody applauds, while the people who were supposed to be closest to you were somewhere else entirely, I want to hear about that person in the comments because I think they don't get talked about enough in stories like this one. This isn't really a story about my mother. It's a story about the difference between the people who love you loudly when it's convenient and the ones who just quietly keep showing up. Item 4. Christmas, 2017. This one isn't about a check. Marcus and I drove the 220 miles to Millbrook, the way we did most years, and arrived to find that Colby had gotten a used pickup truck as a gift. Nothing extravagant, but new tires and a full detail, sitting in the driveway with a bow zip tied to the antenna. I hadn't gotten anything that year, and I want to be fair here, because I wasn't expecting a truck. What stuck with me was smaller than that. My mother handed me a card with $40 in it and said, "We didn't know what you'd need, since you're so far away now, you probably have everything already." I remember standing in that kitchen doing the math in my head without meaning to, the way I do math without meaning to, and coming up with a gap I didn't have a category for yet. I didn't say anything. Marcus squeezed my hand under the table at dinner, which was the only acknowledgement I got that day that anyone else had noticed. Item 5. 2020, the year of the wheelchair ramp, and also, separately, the year my father's shop nearly lost its biggest supplier contract because a shipment went out 3 weeks late. I found out later, from Ed Prosser at the funeral, that the delay happened because Colby had been handling logistics and simply hadn't placed the order on time, and that my father had covered the resulting penalty fee himself, out of his own retirement account, rather than let it become a conversation at the dinner table. Ed told me this like it was a small, funny story about a young man learning the ropes. I didn't laugh. I filed it the way I file everything, in the part of my brain that keeps a running tally even when nobody asked it to. I want to be honest that during these years, I wasn't walking around Millbrook with a grudge on display. To everyone in that town, including most of my own family, I looked like the daughter who'd moved away and gotten busy, the way daughters do. Nobody in that church basement would have guessed I had a navy folder in a desk drawer 220 miles away, growing by one check at a time, or that my father had a spiral notebook of his own 2 miles from where I stood, growing the same way. 2 people counting in 2 different rooms, and neither of us knew the other one had started. Item 6. And I'm going to jump ahead a little now, because the pattern was set and I don't need to walk you through all 11 checks individually. By 2022, my father had a home health aide coming twice a week, and I was covering it, $2,400 over 6 months, in installments, sent directly to the agency this time instead of to the house, because I'd finally learned. My mother found out anyway. She called the agency and told them the family would be handling payment going forward. They called me confused, because the payments had stopped and nobody had told them why. When I called my mother to ask what happened, she said, and I remembered this word for word because it was the kind of sentence you don't forget, "Family takes care of family, Dana. We don't need you writing checks like we're one of your little audits." I was 32 years old. I had, by that point, built a career on catching people who quietly moved money around and then told a story about why it wasn't a big deal. I recognized what she was doing. I just didn't have anywhere to put that recognition yet. By the end of that year, I had 11 photocopied checks in a Navy folder in my home office, totaling $6,140. Every single one refused, torn, or returned, with a note designed to sting. I want to be very clear about something, because I think it's the part people misunderstand about folders like mine. I was not building a case. I genuinely was not thinking about inheritance, or fairness, or some future reckoning. I was doing what I do at work every single day, which is keep records, because in my experience the moment you stop keeping records is the moment somebody decides the story can be whatever they need it to be. During those same years, my career was quietly becoming something. I'd started at a small firm in Columbus doing basic reconciliation work, unglamorous stuff, and by 2021 I'd moved to a company called Bellwether Assurance investigating insurance fraud. The kind of work where you spend 6 months on a single claim looking for the day the numbers stop telling the truth. In late 2023, I closed a case involving a contractor who'd been padding storm damage claims across 3 counties, and it ended up in a small feature in the Regional Business Journal. Nothing glamorous, half a page, my photo standing in front of a filing cabinet looking exactly as thrilled as you'd expect. I didn't send it to my parents. I didn't think about it again until months later. Item 7, out of order chronologically but worth telling here. In the spring of 2023, Colby got into some trouble with a repossession notice on a boat he'd bought without telling anyone, and my mother called me, not to ask for money outright. She'd learned by then that direct requests didn't work on me anymore, but to mention, almost offhand, that your brother's going through a rough patch, it would mean a lot to your father if the family pulled together. I asked what pulling together meant in dollars. She said she didn't know, she'd have to check, and never called back with a number. I found out from Ed Prosser months later, that my father had quietly covered it himself, $4,400, out of the shop's emergency fund, the same fund that was supposed to cover equipment repairs. He never told me that either. I only learned it because Ed mentioned it the same way he mentioned everything, like it was ordinary weather. My father noticed my work, though. I know that now, though I didn't know it then because a coworker of his, a man named Ed Prosser who'd worked the lathe next to him for 11 years, mentioned to him in passing that his daughter-in-law's cousin had read something about a Whitfield catching a fraud ring out near Zanesville. My father asked Ed to bring him the article the next day. He read it, according to what I found out later, 3 times, and he kept the clipping folded in his wallet for the rest of his life. He never told me he'd seen it. He never told my mother either. By then his cardiologist had him on a schedule of appointments every 6 weeks, then every 4, then every 2. The kind of tightening interval that anyone in a numbers-based profession recognizes as a countdown even when nobody says the word out loud. I started flying home more often that year, not on a fixed schedule, just whenever the interval between his phone calls sounding tired got shorter than I liked. Vivian kept driving her 40 minutes on Tuesdays regardless. My mother kept her Ladies' Guild meetings on the books. I don't say that to score a point, not anymore. I say it because it's simply what the calendar looked like, and calendars, in my experience, are one of the few things in a family that don't lie. That same winter, his heart started failing in earnest, the kind of decline where every month there's a new medication and a new specialist and a slightly harder conversation with the cardiologist. And that is when, as far as I can tell now, something in my father shifted. Because in January of 2025, 14 months before he died, he started meeting privately, without my mother's knowledge, with an estate attorney named Grace Liu, whose office sits in the county seat 25 minutes from Millbrook. I didn't know any of this at the time. Nobody did. Let me bring you back, though, to the last 2 years of his life, because there's one more thread you need before we get to the funeral, and it involves my brother. Colby had been living in the walkout basement apartment at my parents' house since he was 26, 6 years, rent-free, working what he called part-time at the shop, which by that point my father could no longer run alone. Colby handled the books. That detail matters more than anything else I'm going to tell you, so hold on to it. In the fall of 2024, my father mentioned to me, on one of our quiet Sunday phone calls, the ones he'd started making after Vivian's example finally rubbed off on him, that the shop's numbers had gotten confusing. He said it the way a man says something he's not ready to say out loud yet. I asked him what he meant. He said he'd figure it out. He didn't ask for my help, and I didn't push, because I'd learned by then that pushing my father into a conversation before he was ready only made him quieter. What I didn't know, and wouldn't know until months after his funeral, was that my father had started keeping his own ledger, in a spiral notebook he kept in the bottom drawer of his workbench, tracking every withdrawal Colby made from the shop's operating account that he couldn't account for with an invoice or a receipt. Small at first. 100 here, 300 there. The kind of thing a struggling adult child borrows and means to pay back. By the time my father stopped writing in that notebook, 3 weeks before he died, the total sat at $61,485. If this story is starting to feel familiar to you, if you've ever watched one sibling get quietly excused for things that would have ended your relationship with your parents entirely, I need you to stick around, because we are almost to the part where my father's silence turned out to be the loudest thing he ever did. Subscribe if this is the kind of story you want more of. I'm not going to ask you twice in this video. My father died on a Tuesday morning in March, 71 years old, congestive heart failure, in the hospital bed my mother had finally, after years of resistance, allowed into the front room of the house. Who was there? Vivian was there. Colby was there. My mother was there too, and I want to be fair, because in that room, at that exact moment, I don't think she was performing anything. I think she was genuinely losing the man she'd been married to for 43 years, and grief doesn't always show up looking the way we expect it to. I held that thought carefully for the 4 days between his death and his funeral because I wanted to give her room to be a person and not just an antagonist in a story I was already, without fully admitting it to myself, starting to narrate. The funeral was at First Lutheran, the church where she'd worked for 2 decades, on a Saturday, and about 40 people came, most of them people my father had known his whole life, men who'd worked the floor at the shop with him, women from Vivian's side of the family, a scattering of cousins. Afterward, at the reception in the church basement, over sheet cake and coffee in styrofoam cups, my mother stood up. She was wearing the cream-colored suit she wears to every funeral and every wedding in that congregation, the one I've seen so many times I could describe the exact shade of it in my sleep. She thanked everyone for coming, and then, in front of all 40 of them, she said, "Walter would want everyone to know the house is staying in the family." Colby's going to take it over since he's the one who stayed here all these years and looked after things. Some of us show up when it counts. 40 seconds of silence followed that sentence. I counted them, the way I count things when I don't know what else to do with my hands, and at the end of it my mother crossed the room, pressed an envelope into my hand, old and soft at the corners, and said quietly, "Just for me. This isn't the time to be asking questions about the estate." Then she turned and accepted a hug from Pastor Reyes like nothing had happened at all. About 20 minutes later, I was refilling a coffee urn in the church kitchen, mostly to have something to do with my hands, when I saw Colby's phone sitting face up on the counter next to a stack of paper plates, plugged into a wall charger, screen lit from a fresh notification. I wasn't looking for anything. I want to be clear about that because I've thought about it 100 times since, and I still believe it. I was reaching past it for a sleeve of styrofoam cups when the screen refreshed with a new message in a thread labeled, "Mom plus Colby." And the preview line was long enough that I read it without meaning to. It was from my mother, sent 9 minutes earlier, while she was still accepting condolences 20 feet away from where I stood. "Don't tell Dana about the shop accounts yet. Let's get the house transferred first, then we'll figure out the funeral costs. She's the one with money, she'll pay if we ask right." I stood there holding a sleeve of styrofoam cups for what felt like a long time, and was probably closer to 6 seconds. I didn't pick up the phone. I didn't scroll further. I put the cups down, walked back out to the fellowship hall, and did not say a single word about it to anyone that day, not even Marcus, not even Vivian. I want you to understand that this was not restraint for the sake of a good story. It was the same instinct that governs everything I do professionally. You don't confront a discrepancy the moment you find it. You confirm it, you document what you saw as precisely as you can while it's still fresh, and you wait until you're standing somewhere the other person can't simply talk over you. That night, in the motel room, after Ivy had fallen asleep, I wrote down the exact wording of that message on the notes app on my phone, time-stamped, before I could second-guess a single word of it. I did not open the envelope in the church basement. I did not open it in the parking lot, where Vivian found me standing next to my car for a full 2 minutes before she said anything, just stood beside me with her hand on my back, the same way she'd stood beside my father at 100 appointments nobody else attended. I did not open it that night, at the motel off Route 9, where Marcus and Ivy were waiting for me with a room service pizza and a 5-year-old who wanted to know why Mommy's eyes looked funny. I put the envelope in the outside pocket of my suitcase and I zipped it shut, and I told myself I would deal with it when I got home, when I had the emotional bandwidth to be told, in whatever form my mother had chosen, exactly how little I was owed. At 9:14 the next morning, my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize with the local area code. I almost let it go to voicemail. I answered instead, mostly out of habit, the same instinct that makes me pick up every unknown number in case it's a client. "Dana Whitfield?" A woman's voice, calm, professional. "My name is Grace Liu. I was your father's attorney. I'd like to speak with you privately, before anyone else in the family, if that's all right. There's a document your father asked me to keep separate from the rest of the estate file. He was very specific that no one else was to see it until I'd spoken with you first." I sat down on the edge of the motel bed. Marcus, across the room pouring cereal for Ivy, looked over at my face and went still. "What kind of document?" I asked. "I'd rather explain it in person," Grace said. "But I can tell you this much on the phone. Your father spent the last 14 months of his life making sure that whatever your mother said at that funeral, it wasn't going to be the last word on how his estate gets settled. Can you come to my office Thursday? I'd like your brother and mother to come Friday, separately, so I can speak with you first." I hung up and sat there for a moment, the phone warm in my hand, and I remembered the envelope. I got up, found my suitcase, unzipped the outside pocket, and opened it. Inside was a single photocopy. It was the very first check, the $150 check from 2005, the one my mother had returned with the note that said, "We're not a charity." She had kept a copy of it, apparently, for 10 years, and she had chosen this, out of everything she could have given me, out of 10 years of my father's life and 43 years of her marriage, as my inheritance. There was no note this time. She didn't need one. The check said everything she'd ever needed to say to me, and she knew I'd understand it, because she knew exactly what she'd taught me to keep. I sat on that motel bed for a long time with the photocopy in my lap, and I want to describe what that felt like as precisely as I can, because I think precision is the only honest way I know how to talk about it. It wasn't the sting of the original rejection that had dulled years ago into something closer to a scar than a wound. It was the discovery that she'd held onto it for a decade, filed it away somewhere in that same meticulous handwriting she used for the guild's ledgers, waiting for the exact right moment to hand it back to me as a verdict. 10 years is a long time to keep a grudge in a drawer. I know, because I'd been keeping one of my own for just as long, in a folder 220 miles away, and it took that photocopy landing in my palm for me to understand that we had never actually been keeping different records. We had been keeping the same one, from opposite sides of it the whole time. Marcus found me still sitting there when he came back in with Ivy from the motel breakfast bar, and he didn't ask what was in the envelope. He just sat down next to me, took my hand, and waited until I was ready to say something, which is its own kind of showing up, the quiet kind nobody puts in a toast at a wedding. I want to tell you something about what it feels like to realize your mother has been quietly building a case against you for a decade, using your own generosity as the evidence, while you were building a folder using her own rejection as the evidence, and neither of you ever told the other one you were counting. It's not rage, not at first. It's something colder and stranger, closer to recognition. Like finally seeing the shape of a room you'd only ever felt your way through in the dark. If you've ever found out that the version of you your family had been telling each other for years bore almost no resemblance to the person you actually were, stay with me. Because what my father left behind is the part of this story that changed everything, and I want you watching when we get there. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from tonight, because I read every single one, and this next part is worth waiting for. I drove to Grace Lou's office on Thursday alone. Marcus offered to come, and I told him I needed to hear whatever this was without anyone watching my face while I heard it. Her office was small, above a pharmacy on the town square in Ashworth, the kind of place with a window unit air conditioner and a framed law degree that had clearly been hung a little crooked years ago and never fixed. She was younger than I expected, maybe 40, with the kind of calm, unhurried manner that made me trust her within the first 90 seconds. "Your father came to me in January of last year," she said, sliding a thin manila folder across the desk. "He told me he'd been watching something happen in his own household for years and hadn't had the courage to stop it, and that he intended to spend whatever time he had left fixing what he could." Inside the folder were two things. The first was a spiral notebook, my father's handwriting, cramped and slanted the way it had always been on grocery lists and birthday cards, dated entries starting in September of 2022 and ending 3 weeks before he died. Dates, amounts. Colby, cash from register, no receipt, $340. Colby, transfer to personal account, told me it was for a supplier. Supplier says no order placed, $185. Page after page, the total building the way rust builds, until the last entry, in a hand that was noticeably shakier than the first, read simply, "Total as of today, $61,485. I don't know how to say this to her. I'm going to say it to Dana instead, in the only way I know how. The second document was a memorandum of understanding, notarized, establishing an irrevocable trust for the house on Birch Hollow Road, naming me as trustee, with instructions that the property could not be transferred to any beneficiary, including Colby, until an independent appraisal was completed and the shop's operating account discrepancy was formally resolved through a repayment plan. Attached to it, in an envelope of its own, was a letter, handwritten, 4 pages, addressed to me. I'm not going to read you the whole letter because some of it was just between us, but I want to tell you what mattered most. He wrote that he'd found my folder once, years earlier, going through my desk drawer looking for a stamp during a visit, 11 photocopied checks in a navy folder, and that he'd never told me he'd seen it because he didn't know what to say that wouldn't sound like an apology he wasn't brave enough to make in front of my mother. He wrote that he'd kept his own count of everything after that, quietly, the same way I had, because he said, in his own words, "I guess you get that from me, the keeping track of things. I just never had anywhere to put mine until now." And he wrote that the article about the fraud case, the one I never even sent him, was the thing that finally made him understand I hadn't left home to escape the family. I'd left to become someone who couldn't be talked out of the truth anymore. I asked Grace why he hadn't just changed the will outright and been done with it. She said he'd asked her the same question of himself more than once in their meetings. He told me a new will would just be one more piece of paper your mother could contest or ignore, and he didn't trust a single document to hold up against 43 years of her being able to talk a room into agreeing with her. He wanted something that put a person in charge instead. Someone who couldn't be talked out of the facts. She paused. His words, not mine. He was very specific that it had to be you. I asked what would happen if I simply refused. If I handed the trustee role to someone else, a bank, a neutral third party, anyone who didn't have to sit across a desk from my own mother. Grace told me that was entirely my right, and that my father had built in exactly that option, a clause allowing me to appoint a corporate trustee if I chose not to serve. She said it plainly, without any pressure attached to it, which somehow made the decision easier than if she'd tried to talk me into anything. I sat with the folder open on my lap for a long moment, thinking about a spiral notebook in a workbench drawer and 11 photocopies in a folder of my own, and told her I'd do it myself. "There's one more thing," Grace said, once I'd had a minute. "He asked me to make sure you understood something before Friday. This isn't about punishing your brother. It's about making sure the house doesn't get handed over as a reward for a story that isn't accurate. What happens from here is your decision, as trustee. He trusted you to be fair in a way he doesn't think anyone else in this family knows how to be anymore." That night, I told Marcus everything, and I called Vivian, who was quiet on the other end of the line for a long time before she said, "Your father called me 2 weeks before he died. Said he needed to know I'd be there Friday if things went the way he thought they might." I told him I wouldn't miss it for anything. I hadn't known that either. Apparently my father had spent his last months making sure I wouldn't have to sit in that room alone, even if he wasn't going to be the one sitting beside me. The night before, I sat at the motel desk after Ivy had fallen asleep and laid out both folders side by side, the navy one that had been mine for a decade and the manila one that had been my father's for 14 months, and I made myself read through all of it one more time, start to finish, the way I'd review a file before presenting it to a claims board. Marcus asked at one point if I wanted him to sit with me while I did it. I told him I needed to do this part alone, the same way I'd told Grace, but I asked him to stay in the room, which he did, reading a paperback in the chair by the window without saying a word, which was its own kind of company. Around midnight, I stopped rereading and just sat there, looking at both sets of handwriting, mine and my father's, and thinking about how strange it was that the two of us had spent a decade keeping the exact same kind of record without ever once comparing notes. On the morning of the meeting, I stopped at Sawyer's Diner for coffee before driving to Ashworth, mostly because I couldn't sit in the motel room any longer watching Ivy eat cereal in front of a cartoon. The waitress who took my order, a woman named Peg who has worked that counter for as long as I can remember, recognized me from the funeral and didn't ask why I looked the way I looked. She just topped off my coffee twice without me asking, told me my father used to sit at the third stool from the end every Thursday morning and order the same thing for 30 years, and slid an extra biscuit onto my plate on the house. "He was proud of you," she said, wiping down the counter, not making a thing of it. "Told half this diner about that newspaper article. Didn't shut up about it for a week." I hadn't known that either. I sat with that for a minute before I paid and left, and I drove to Ashworth steadier than I'd felt in 4 days. Friday came, and I need you to understand the room before I tell you what happened in it, because where a conversation like this takes place matters more than people think. My mother had assumed, I found out later, that Friday's meeting would be a formality, a reading of a will that confirmed what she'd already announced at the funeral. Marcus had driven up with me that morning and was parked outside in the lot with Ivy and a box of crayons, close enough that I could see the car from the conference room window if I needed to, which mattered more to me than I expected it to once I was actually sitting there. She walked into Grace Lou's small office at 11 in the morning wearing the same cream-colored suit, carrying a single sheet of paper with a handwritten list on it, and Colby walked in behind her, not quite meeting my eyes. Grace's conference room was small, 4 chairs around a table built for 6, a window unit humming in the corner, a legal pad and a pen laid out at each seat like place settings. Grace had set my chair at the head of the table, closest to the window, and I understood, without her ever saying it out loud, that she'd done that on purpose. She opened with a short, procedural summary, the reading of a name, a date, a case number, the same flat cadence I use myself when I open a findings meeting, and I remember being grateful for it, because it gave the room a shape before anyone in it had a chance to bring their own. "I've written up what the estate owes for the funeral costs," my mother said, before anyone had even sat down, sliding the paper toward me across the desk. $14,270. The flowers, the luncheon, the headstone deposit, my dress. "You're the one with the good job, Dana, so I assumed you'd want to handle this part. Family takes care of family." I didn't answer right away. I've learned, in 11 years of reading numbers that are supposed to add up and don't, that the first thing you do is not react to the number, you check it against the invoice. So I did that, out loud, calmly, the way I'd read a finding to a claims board. "The funeral home invoice is $8,100. I have a copy. Split 3 ways, evenly, the way an estate debt should be handled. That's $2,700 each. I'll write that check today." I set my own copy of the invoice on the desk next to hers. "I'm not writing a check for the other $6,170 on your list because there's no invoice behind it." My mother's face did something I hadn't seen before, a flicker of surprise that she covered almost immediately with irritation. "This is exactly what I mean about you, Dana. Your father is barely in the ground and you're auditing his funeral." "I'm not auditing the funeral," I said. "I'm auditing the last decade." I opened my own folder, the navy one, and set it on the desk. 11 photocopies. You said some of us show up when it counts, and some of us just send money. I want to walk you through the money I sent. I read the list, in order, dates, and amounts, the way I'd read a case file to a room of people who needed facts, not feelings. 11 checks, $6,140. Every single one returned, torn, or refused. My mother's jaw tightened with each one, but she didn't interrupt, and for the first time in my life, I watched her run out of a script. Then Grace opened the second folder, and I watched my brother go pale before she'd even finished the first sentence. Your father kept his own records too, Grace said, and read the notebook aloud, the same way I had, date by date, no commentary, no accusation, just numbers matching the exact rhythm of a man watching his son quietly take apart the only thing he had left to leave anyone. $61,485. Colby stared at the desk for most of it, and I watched his hands, which had gone still in a way that told me more than any denial could have. When Grace finished, he finally spoke, low, to the desk more than to any of us. I was going to pay it back. I kept telling myself I was going to pay it back before he found out. Nobody answered him. There wasn't really an answer that would have helped anything in that moment, and I think he knew it, because he didn't say anything else for the rest of the meeting. My mother spoke first, and when she did, her voice had lost the certainty it had carried since the funeral. He never told me any of this. 4 words, and underneath them, for just a moment, something that sounded less like anger and more like fear. I didn't know. I swear to you, I didn't know about the shop money. A silence followed, 8 seconds, and in it I saw my mother, for the first time in as long as I could remember, look genuinely uncertain of what came next. Then, just as quickly, she pulled it back. But you don't understand what it's like, watching your children grow up and leave and pretend that's normal? Someone had to hold this family together. Someone had to make Millbrook feel like it mattered to at least one of you. You could have called me, I said. Any of the 11 times I sent something, you could have called and told me the truth instead of a check. I would have listened. And said what? Her voice cracked on the second word just slightly before she caught it. That I was scared of what it meant if the only one of my children who turned out fine was the one who couldn't wait to leave. For a moment, nobody in the room said anything at all. It was the closest my mother came in that entire meeting to telling the truth without being asked to read it off a page first, and I want to give her that even now. It didn't last. Within a breath, she straightened her shoulders and reached for the list still sitting on the desk, as if picking it back up could undo what she'd just said. That doesn't change what your father would have wanted for this family. He's the son who stayed, I said quietly, giving her back her own line from the funeral, flat, without heat. According to my father's own handwriting, what he stayed for was $61,485, and you didn't know because you never once asked how a part-time job at a failing machine shop was paying for a truck he financed 2 years ago. Nobody spoke for a while after that. It was Vivian, sitting quietly in the corner chair where she'd been the whole meeting, who finally broke the silence, not with a speech, just a single sentence, spoken to my mother without malice. Walter asked me to be here today because he didn't think you'd let her say any of this without someone else in the room. I think he was right to ask. I laid out the terms of the trust, in the same flat, procedural voice I use when I present findings at work. The house would remain in trust. Colby could stay in the property, but the shop's operating account would need to be repaid on a documented schedule before any transfer of ownership could be considered, verified by an independent bookkeeper, not by me. I would not be taking a percentage of the house, and I would not be accepting reimbursement for the 11 checks. That money was gone the day I sent it, and I had never sent it expecting it back. What I would not do, I told them both, was let a version of this family's history stand where staying in a basement for free counted as caretaking and getting on a plane 4 times a year to sit in hospital rooms counted as absence. My mother left first, without another word, the untouched funeral cost list still sitting on the desk where I'd left it. Colby stayed behind for a moment. He looked at me, and for a second I thought he might say something, but he didn't, not that day. He just nodded once, picked up his coat, and left. 9 months passed. I'm not going to pretend it was a straight line, because it wasn't. My mother sent exactly one text message in that time, in June, that read, "Your father would want peace in this family. I hope you can find a way to give him that." I read it twice. I never wrote back, and I want to be honest with you about why. Peace isn't something you're owed just because you're the one asking for it loudest, and I wasn't willing to hand her a version of forgiveness that cost me nothing to give and meant nothing when she got it. Colby called in December on a Sunday at 6 in the evening, which I don't think was an accident. He told me he'd been making the payments Grace's office had set up, $500 a month toward the $61,000, and that he'd moved out of the basement into a small apartment above the hardware store downtown. "I should have told you," he said before the funeral was even over. There was a group chat. Mom wanted me to help get you to cover the costs before you found out about the shop money, because once you knew, she figured you wouldn't be as willing to pay. I saw the messages. I didn't say anything because if I said something, the money stopped. I asked him why now, why 9 months and not the day after the meeting in Grace's office, and he was quiet for a second before he answered. Because I needed it to be true before I told you, not just something I said to make you feel better about me. I didn't want to call you with an apology I hadn't actually earned yet. I told him that was probably the first sentence he'd ever said to me that sounded like something our father would have said. He laughed, a small, surprised sound, like he hadn't expected that to land as a compliment, and said he'd take it. It wasn't a full accounting of everything, and I don't think it was supposed to be. But it was more honesty than I'd gotten from him in 6 years, and I told him so. We talk on Sundays now, the same way Vivian always called our father. No visits yet, no money moving between us, just talking. The way you rebuild something you're not sure will hold weight yet, slowly. Checking it at every joint before you trust it with anything heavier. Vivian still calls too, every Sunday at 6, and last month she started calling Colby on Wednesdays as well, which nobody asked her to do and which she has not made a single comment about, because that has never been how she operates. She sent me the teal mixing bowl in October, the one with the chip in the rim, wrapped in a dish towel inside a shipping box with no note attached, and I understood exactly what it meant without needing one. I made the goulash for Marcus and Ivy 2 weeks ago. Ivy didn't love it. I told her that was fine, she'd grow into it the same way I did. The independent bookkeeper finished the appraisal on the shop's accounts in August. Colby is a little over halfway through the repayment schedule now, and Grace tells me he hasn't missed a payment yet. The house on Birch Hollow Road is still sitting in trust, unoccupied for now except for Colby's apartment above the hardware store 2 streets over, and I haven't decided yet what happens to it once the repayment is finished, whether he stays, whether it sells, whether some version of all of us ends up standing in that kitchen again someday for something other than a funeral. I'm in no hurry to decide. My father spent 14 months being patient with a decision like that, and I figure I can afford to spend at least that long myself. Grace tells me trustees usually feel pressure to resolve things quickly, to close the file and move on, and that most of them regret it when they do. I'll believe her. Some numbers need time before they're ready to be added up. Marcus and Ivy and I still have dinner at 6:30 most nights, nothing dramatic about it, just the three of us at a kitchen table that has nothing to do with Birch Hollow Road, and some nights Ivy asks about her grandfather, and I tell her about a man who fixed things for a living and kept a spiral notebook in his workbench drawer because he never stopped believing that somewhere down the line, the numbers would matter to somebody. Last week she asked me if Grandpa Walter would be proud of her for learning to tie her shoes. I told her he would have asked to see it 3 times and then told everyone at Sawyer's Diner about it for a week, and I meant it. Sometimes I think about that envelope, the one my mother handed me before I'd even left the church basement, and how she meant it as the last word, a small cold period at the end of a sentence she'd been writing about me for years. It turned out to be the opposite. It was the first thing that made me go back and open a drawer I'd been avoiding, and on the other side of that drawer was a man who'd spent 14 months making sure her sentence wouldn't be the one that got the final say. That's my story. 11 checks, 1 spiral notebook, and $61,485 that finally told the truth. My mother spent a decade rewriting. If there's one thing I want you to take from it, it's this. The people who love you the loudest in front of a crowd are not always the ones who are actually there. And the ones who stay quiet for years aren't always the ones with nothing to say. Sometimes they're just waiting for the moment when the truth can't be talked out of the room anymore. I don't know what happens next with my mother, and I've stopped needing to know before I can move forward with the rest of my life. Some accounts just stay open. You close what you can close, you leave the rest exactly where it is, and you stop checking the balance every day hoping it'll change. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needed to hear it, and tell me in the comments what the one who stayed looked like in your family, because I don't think it's always who gets the credit for it. Thank you for spending this time with me, and I'll see you in the next one.